together to advance one of the most pressing issues in our society. First, I want to start by a big thank you to the Northern California grantmakers for having us. We're so excited to be part of this conference. The Make It So theme is exactly what we aim to do through our work on the CEO Blueprint, which we're excited to share with you today. My name is Mahalet Getachew. I'm the Managing Director of Corporate Racial Equity at PolicyLink. For those of you that do not know PolicyLink, we're a national research and action institute based in Oakland, California, and we're devoted to advancing racial and economic equity in America. For over 2 decades, PolicyLink has been building and leading the racial and economic equity movement in America, dedicated to amplifying the wisdom and resilience of people of color and low-income communities in order to remake our social and economic systems to work for all of us, not just some of us. And what we're covering today, you see here the agenda, we're going to give you an intro into the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance, a wonderful partnership that we're a part of that is really the overarching umbrella of our work on corporate racial equity today and beyond. We're also going to discuss the profound opportunity right now for corporations and philanthropy to advance racial equity. We'll share our 2021 CEO Blueprint for Racial Equity and deep dive into the role of corporate philanthropy specifically. And finally, we're excited to introduce you all to our effort to develop corporate performance standards for racial equity and share how you can get involved in that multi-year effort. This will be an interactive session, so please let us know your thoughts and questions in the chat. Don't be shy. We'll also have polls throughout today so that we can hear from all of you as well. So first, let's start with our first poll. We want to hear from you. What is your role in your organization? If you haven't already chatted it, or if you don't mind filling out the poll again, are you in corporate executive leadership? Are you in corporate social responsibility or philanthropy? Are you in the private sector, in HR, operations, or other functions? Are you in the nonprofits sector or other philanthropy? We'd love to hear from you. Where are you? It'd be great to see that. And I think, not sure if everyone can see the results coming in, but I do see them coming in. And let's give it a moment. Awesome. All right, let's end the poll and see where we're at. We have a lot of folks from corporate philanthropy, CSR, from the nonprofit sector, other philanthropic team members here, and others in the nonprofit or other from nonprofit. Sorry, that's a little unclear. And now we can close the poll. I'm ready to get started. Awesome. So I already shared a little bit about PolicyLink, and we also have our amazing partners here, FSG and Just Capital. Just Capital is the leading organization evaluating companies on stakeholder capitalism. Just like us, they believe the world needs more just companies. And FSG is a mission-driven consulting firm guiding business and foundation leaders in creating large-scale, lasting social change with over 2 decades of experience doing that. Together, we founded the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance to support the evolution of anti-racist, equitable corporations that can effectively contribute to building a just, equitable, and healthy nation for all of us. That is our vision. And our mission is to ignite the racial equity movement more broadly and deeply in corporate America. We can go to the next slide. And we do that with strategic guidance for business leaders like the CEO Blueprint for Racial Equity, which we'll talk about today, and through our effort to develop robust corporate performance standards for racial equity, which you'll also hear about today as well. So what do we mean? When we talk about equity, what do we mean? Equity is the just and fair inclusion into a society in which all of us, not just certain groups, can participate, prosper, and reach our full potential. Racial equity then is when race or ethnicity has no influence on how one fares in society. It means the absence of discrimination based on race or ethnicity. And it also means the presence of values and systems that ensure fairness and justice for all people. This is our guiding ethos in our work because we know equity can unlock so much potential in our society, especially in business and philanthropy. Now, how we achieve racial equity, it's an extremely complex and challenging subject, and even more so in the context of the role that organizations, businesses, philanthropy play. But it is a profound topic for all of us. I know all of you are here today because you know our futures are embedded in this topic. Wherever we come from and whatever roles we play at our organizations, our fates are connected. And our hope is that through the CEO Blueprint, everyone comes to see equity as a core part of their roles day to day. Now, our theory of change, though, is even bigger than that on the next slide. Right now, there are 100 million people in America living at or near poverty. That's 1 in 3 of us, and most are people of color. The 100 million also includes 48 million poor white people caught up in the structural barriers that have been holding back people of color for centuries. We believe that to achieve an equitable nation, achieve an equitable globe, corporations must take action to improve the lives of the most economically insecure. Civil society and government, we know, cannot do it alone. And if businesses can meaningfully advance racial equity within and beyond their 4 walls, including through philanthropy, but not limited to it, we will go a long way towards addressing the barriers hampering economic opportunity for all. Now, why focus on the 100 million and racial equity? We hear that question all the time. The COVID-19 pandemic and our nation's long overdue reckoning on racial injustice have thrust into sharp relief the results of centuries of economic inequality and systemic racism. We know that people of color and low-income communities have been hit exceptionally hard. Even before the pandemic, the 100 million already struggled to make ends meet, and they continue to bear the heaviest toll. We often find, though, that business leaders still believe in or are worried that racial equity is a zero-sum game, and that's not limited to business leaders. We know that there's also an ingrained societal suspicion that intentionally supporting one group hurts another. But in fact, we know the opposite is true. We have researched this, and research from others demonstrates as well that when we target policies and programs on the most vulnerable and historically excluded groups, the benefits cascade upward and outward for all of us. This is known as the curb cut effect. Today, we all take for granted how those curb cuts and sidewalks when we cross the street came about. They were advocated for by the disability rights community in order to just navigate our streets. The simplest change, though, has made it safer and easier for all of us to get around. So when we design the circumstances that allow those who have been left behind to participate and contribute fully, everyone wins. And that's what the quote here embodies and is the ultimate goal of our work through the Blueprint. Now, with that introduction about our work, I want to share a little bit of a background and really about the opportunity for corporations, business leaders, and investors and others in the private sector to advance racial equity. And I'm going to do this by sharing with you 3 powerful gifts that we have to accelerate meaningful change. The first is on the next slide, and that is that America's face is changing. By 2050, if not sooner, people of color will be the majority. Our rising racial and economic and ethnic diversity is a tremendous asset, but if only everyone can access what they need to thrive. If the opposite happens and economic conditions do not improve among people of color, a larger and larger share of our population will struggle to make ends meet. And such widespread economic insecurity is unsustainable and will threaten the stability of our markets. In fact, according to the National Equity Atlas, racial gaps in income and employment cost our nation over $2 trillion in 2018 alone. Imagine that, just 1 year, and the trillions in losses keep stacking up every year. That is a huge missed opportunity, and businesses have a critical role to play here in ensuring that all the talent across our nation has the opportunity to contribute meaningfully and thrive. Another powerful gift is that our priorities are also changing. Now more than ever, business leaders are seen as civic leaders. Workers, consumers, investors, communities, they all want business leaders to do more on racial and economic equity. And what's shown here is data from the 2021 Edelman Trust Barometer. Based on their latest global study, 86% of respondents agree that CEOs must lead on societal issues. Their study also uncovered that most agree CEOs should lead on change rather than waiting for regulation, and that CEOs should hold themselves accountable to the public, not just to their board of directors or stockholders. Now, zeroing in on the US on the next slide, here's powerful polling data for Just Capital. From Just Capital, showing that 95% of Black Americans and 79% of Americans overall believe it's important for companies to promote racial diversity and equity in the workplace. And 83% of Black Americans and 64% of Americans overall say companies have so much more work to do to achieve racial equity. Those are your co-workers and teammates who feel that way. And now for the third gift. The business community has unparalleled resources and skills within reach to bring about the racial and economic equity we all want. As you see here, on an annual basis in the US, the private sector has 22 trillion in resources annually, compared with a fraction of that in the nonprofit sector and in government. On top of that, we know that business leaders possess incredibly unique skills in shifting our legal and regulatory frameworks to their will. When CEOs speak, whether with their dollars or their voices, our politicians and lawmakers invariably listen. Those skills, ably wielded and directed, can unlock the public policy wins we need to finally achieve racial and economic equity. This isn't about saying the business leaders need to solve all our issues and pay for everything, but it shows in stark relief that there are untapped resources available in the private sector that can and ought to be deployed in more equitable and productive ways for all of us. Now, what we've seen over the last year is incredibly historic. The level of interest and engagement in the private sector for racial equity issues continues at an unprecedented level. Now the private sector, they say, is a leading funder of racial equity and justice efforts with supposedly 200 billion in stated commitments. That's incredible. Yet for all of this activity, deeply transformational system-wide efforts have yet to emerge. Part of the problem is that we're not thinking about the ways in which companies influence our lives every day. And we can see that on the next slide. This framework makes me so excited. Go ahead and click once. About all the possibilities for profound change. These are all the ways in which we can think about how companies have an opportunity to drive equity as wealth creator, cultural influencer, investor. And as you learn today, the blueprint taps into these ways that companies can pull all of these levers to help ensure all the good intention, energy, and resources in the private sector goes to deeply transformational work and not simply more tinkering around the edges. So as you listen today and ask yourself, we ask you to ask yourself, do I really know the impacts of our products, policies, and practices on people of color and low-income communities? What can I do in my role, especially in corporate philanthropy, to activate the rest of the business? And am I tapping into all of my strengths in order to do that? And finally, on this next slide, just want to drive home this point. With all of the commitment towards racial equity and justice, there have been a few studies out very recently that question really the transformational nature of all of that commitment and all of the news around things going on with investments being made by so many in the private sector. And the key here, the big takeaway, is that we really have to focus on transformational change. It is so important to really demand the equitable outcomes that these investments are made to achieve. And a focus for us today is to talk deeply about how corporate philanthropy can play an even more productive role in ways that you're already working. And to pinpoint here as an example that funding racial equity means incredibly funding grassroots organizations. It isn't funding the work in a way that has been done before. It's about doing it in a very different way that has ever been done before. And with that, I'd like to transition now to my colleague at FSG, Kendra Berenson.
Great, thanks so much, Mahalet, and hello, everybody. So glad you're able to be here with us today. I'm going to start by doing a brief overview of the CEO Blueprint for Racial Equity. PolicyLink, FSG, and Just Capital came together to develop the CEO Blueprint for Racial Equity, which is a pathway for business leaders to tap into their greatest strengths to significantly advance racial equity across all of their domains of influence, within their four walls, within the communities in which they're situated, and at the broader societal level. It outlines actions and new ways of operating across their entire footprint. The three domains of the blueprint are mutually reinforcing, and the blueprint describes actions relating to each of the following topics. Within the company, key shifts relating to governance and leadership that will ensure accountability for racial equity at all levels of the organization. HR policies that are not just not racist, but anti-racist, and strategies for building worker power and voice. We also describe how companies should conduct an enterprise-wide racial equity audit to understand the intended and unintended impacts of their products, services, operations, policies, and practices on people of color and low-income communities, and take action to stop harm, and instead leverage business strategy in support of racial equity. Within the community, companies should develop authentic and sustained connection to community members and leverage corporate philanthropy to make systemic change to address racial inequities. We'll discuss that in a lot more detail shortly. Companies should assess both their local and national policy priorities to ensure that they align with a policy to do no harm to people of color, and analyze and mitigate the environmental impact of your operations, specifically on communities of color. And finally, at the societal level, companies should leverage their influence, capital, and voice to advance racial equity. And so we'll now get into a further layer deeper of detail into the specific actions described in the blueprint. So we started with an overview of all of the actions, and they're all important, but we know that every company is in a different starting place, and it can feel overwhelming to know where to begin. So we have identified 12 high leverage actions that companies should start with. Each is impactful in itself, and through the process of implementing these actions, companies will build capacity, surface information, and build relationships that will enable further action. As I read through these 12 actions, I ask you to consider which actions your company or organization in the nonprofit or other sector is already taking, and which you would like to take on next. Establish an anti-racism policy. Conduct a racial equity audit. Incorporate racial equity into the company's ESG commitments. Set and publicly disclose specific targets to hire, retain, and promote a racially diverse workforce, leadership, and board. Pay a living wage at all levels. Extend benefits to all, including part-time employees. Allow workers to organize and voice their opinion to leadership. Discontinue products, capital, and services that cause harm to communities of color. Assess local policy positions and political giving to ensure that you are not harming communities of color and that you are advancing racial equity. Mitigate the environmental impact of your operations on communities of color. Defend our multiracial democracy using your voice and your influence, and invest directly in low-income communities of color. So taking all 12 of these actions together, consider what would be the impact if you were to implement all 12 of them. Again, knowing that this is just the starting place with the blueprint. All right. So we've done a little bit of an orientation to the CEO Blueprint and invite you to pick it up and read the whole thing. It's available on our website. But now we want to dive a little bit deeper, specifically into the role that corporate philanthropy can play. But before that, we want to get a sense of how racial equity is showing up in your corporate philanthropy today. So we're going to do another poll, and I'll ask you all to share, does racial equity show up in your corporate philanthropy strategy? And if you work in another kind of foundation, feel free to answer as well. I'll give people just another couple of seconds to respond to the poll. All right. Well, this is really great to see. It looks like almost 2/3 say this is a central focus of your work. And I think that is a big shift over just the last year, from perhaps being somewhat of a focus to actually being a central focus. And then I see a lot of others who see this as an important part of their work, or who maybe haven't made it explicit yet, but are just starting to bring it in. So thanks so much for sharing. And we'd like to dial in a little bit more deeply now. For those of you who do see this as part of your work, we'd like some more detail about how it shows up. And you can select as many of these as are true. So you can select all of them if they all apply to you. How is racial equity showing up in your philanthropy? Great, and I'll give just another couple of seconds. So seeing some interesting patterns here. Definitely looks like there are a lot of you who are engaged in racial equity trainings and discussion. And then also a lot who are assessing the proportion of grant making that goes to people of color-led work or racial equity and root causes. And I think that's really interesting, right? Because we often start with this piece around education, training, building our capacity, and then understanding what is our starting point. So let's actually do that initial audit to even understand where are our dollars going. And then from there, I'm also seeing about half of you have named this explicitly, racial equity explicitly within your mission or strategy, and you're shifting grant-making practices to shift power as well. And then just a few people mentioning multi-year and unrestricted grants. So we'll share some more thoughts and guidance around how to incorporate racial equity into your corporate philanthropy as we go. But really great to see the strategies that you are already employing. Great. So I'm now going to share an overview of 3 of the specific actions within the blueprint that we see as really being in the wheelhouse of corporate philanthropy. So the first one is within the company domain. As part of the board's oversight, ensure that racial equity is incorporated into the company's environmental, social, and governance and human rights commitments and programs, and how the company sets goals and measures progress. So ESG is a process for managing risk by eliciting information and setting measurable goals to mitigate that risk. The process is forward-looking, and it can also surface insight about growth areas where the company is particularly well-suited to contribute. A critical part of the ESG process is identifying risks and engaging internal and external stakeholders to help you understand the links between local conditions and social issues and your business. So it's really important to unpack how systemic racism impacts employees, consumers, supply chain, and the stability and prosperity of our society. Direct engagement with stakeholders on these issues will support you in building trust with them and gaining a deeper understanding of how racial inequities are risks for your business. And it is important for this knowledge to be shared with the board and key decision makers throughout the company. Racial equity should be incorporated in ESG accounting metrics to ensure they actively drive racial equity outcomes. We know that ESG sits in different places in companies, but regardless of your organizational structure, corporate philanthropy is well positioned to support integration of racial equity into the ESG process because of the relationships you hold with community stakeholders and your skills around analyzing complex social issues. So wherever you sit, how can you leverage your knowledge and relationships within the company to drive towards integration of racial equity in your company's ESG process? Moving on to the domain of the community. Assess and repair the extent to which philanthropic programs and grants actively address root causes of racial inequity and go beyond providing charity for communities of color. So consider your current portfolio of grants. How many support programs that provide direct service to individuals? How many support changes in the system, such as building power and capacity of grassroots and community-led organizations, changing laws, or making funding streams more equitable? In our work, we find that foundation staff often overestimate the amount of grant making that is aimed at root causes, when most of the dollars are actually supporting direct service. To be clear, direct service is important. People are suffering the consequences of racial inequities today, and they need resources to create access to education, healthcare, lead-free homes, etc. However, without addressing the root causes of racism, we won't see lasting change at scale. So where to start? I think many of you are probably already doing this, but we encourage you to disaggregate data by race on whatever issues you are focused on. Identify the disparities and engage in a process of inquiry about why these disparities exist. Don't get stuck in analysis paralysis, but it is important to take time to do this, to sit with the data and process what you are learning about the root causes. As part of this process, it is important also to engage with community leaders and racial equity experts and involve them in decision-making about how to direct your philanthropic resources towards addressing root causes of racism. And John will share some more perspectives on this in a little bit. But I'm going to share one final action within the society domain that we think is particularly pertinent for corporate philanthropy to prioritize. Corporate foundations and all foundations have a broad range of tools at their disposal besides grant making. Consider how you're using your voice, influence, and convening power, as well as your dollars, in support of strengthening our democracy. Invest in voting rights infrastructure, specifically grassroots organizations. Support the proposals across the nation that are making it easier and safer to vote. Suspend political contributions to legislators who support voting rights restrictions and/or spread misinformation. And monitor state legislation and take action when proposed legislation would hamper racial justice. So these three actions that I just shared about are key places for corporate philanthropy to contribute. But what role can you play in moving your entire company towards implementing the rest of the actions in the blueprint? I will now pass it to my colleague, John Harper, to share reflections on how to activate the business.
Thanks so much, Kendra. It was kind of great to see the poll there before. We saw a pretty high percentage of folks who are centering racial equity in their corporate giving practice. I wonder how many folks will be able to say that that's also true for how racial equity might be centered in your enterprise-wide strategy. And what does that actually look like, right? So much of what the CEO Blueprint for Racial Equity calls for is this vision for what it looks like to activate a full business. And yet, many of us who sit in corporate philanthropy seats often feel like that's a stretch beyond our control. What does that actually look like? How do I start to partner with others to start to bring this work forward? I don't just want to be this island of corporate philanthropy doing awesome racial equity work and still fighting against tides moving the opposite direction within the core business. So what are those opportunities? What does it look like to start to influence internally? I'm going to lift up 3 here. This first one, from a culture perspective, how do we think about shifting mindsets to disrupt this narrow view of philanthropy as just a necessity for business in terms of risk and reputation and perhaps PR, right? How do we think about positioning philanthropy as a tip of the spear for innovation and learning? What's the role of philanthropy towards our sort of R&D efforts that might be happening elsewhere within the business? How do we think about activating and partnering with key business influencers and leaders to start to carry this work forward? And how do we align the impact and potential value to our corporate purpose, ESG, and enterprise-wide goals? I'll share that we have a client who launched a racial equity initiative similar to many in the midst of 2020. And while we're very proud of the efforts that they've taken thus far, perhaps an opportunity was missed. That instead of telling the story about this initiative starting as a result of a nationwide reckoning on race, could we instead tell the story on a recognition of how our corporate purpose, we might not be living into that for all communities? Corporate purposes so often are a sort of goal statement that speak to all. And if we apply a targeted universalism context, it would encourage us to say that we need targeted strategies to ensure that we achieve that corporate purpose for all. Might our racial equity initiative be an opportunity for us to lean into what those strategies could look like so that we can fulfill our corporate purpose? This is a way of ensuring that your racial equity initiative did not just say time bound, but has that sustainability because it's connected to the full business fully leaning into that corporate purpose. Next slide. We think about this idea of philanthropic giving so often, to Kendra's point, it's sort of narrowed focus on direct service programs, these individual stories of impact. And while those are incredibly important, I don't mean in any way to denigrate direct service, we also know that systems change also requires different work. The need to bring folks together, to think about power sharing, to think about some of those relationships and connections. I won't rehash much of this slide, but I want to focus in on this last bullet, this importance of articulating and monitoring progress against outcomes and not just outputs. So oftentimes when we make these commitments, we'll see things that focus on the long-term vision. I want to move towards a more equitable world or to reduce disparities. And we often then see lots of work on the output side. How many dollars are out of the door in terms of commitments, number of lives touched. And while those might be interesting metrics, they don't actually reflect if we're driving impact, right? And so what might it look like to take your team through an exercise of some really basic theory of change thinking? Not to say that we're going to track and report metrics on all those levels, but it drives strategy and thinking in a different way. If we believe that ultimately what we're trying to do is reduce systemic barriers, then perhaps our hypothesis is that we need a strong, robust nonprofit sector with Black-led nonprofits contributing towards change. What would be the outcomes or the specific metrics that you would understand if we're contributing towards that? How do we start to think about that flavor of tracking outcomes and the analysis and learning that comes from it as a way towards moving towards more of the sustainability? And then finally, this last idea, activating the business, ensuring that racial equity commitments are not just siloed and standalone, time-bound initiatives and programs. How do we think about supporting internal learning and awareness building across business partners? How do we encourage leaders to focus on this ongoing awareness and alignment building with their peers? And how do we start to think about developing explicit links between philanthropy and pushes for a more inclusive corporate culture? We saw in the polls earlier that about 75% of us said that we're participating in racial equity sessions and trainings these days, having conversations with our teams. Are those conversations limited to only members of the grant-making team? Or do they pull in the various business partners that ultimately have a heavy influence on your work? Might you engage in a shared learning journey with your risk and reputation peers, with your communications peers, with your executive leaders? How do we bring others along in this journey? How do we start to help people understand what does it look like to focus a bit more explicitly at the senior leadership level to get them focused on the ongoing awareness and alignment building? So often we tell ourselves this alignment happens at the case of sort of one project or one meeting, as opposed to the ongoing work that's necessary in order to maintain that alignment, particularly at a leadership level. We so often find senior leaders who are interested and engaged in this work of diving into the details with the implementers, often driven by some flavor of concern or fear, perhaps business risk. And while that's helpful or it can be helpful, A very important redirect that we found is how do they focus on aligning their peers? How do they focus on having those conversations that many of us are not positioned to have to start to execute and implement that work at a higher level? That's what this looks like moving forward. And then finally, how do we think about developing explicit links between philanthropy and what's going on more broadly within the business? We're working with we're working with a retailer right now. And I'll never forget that someone on their real estate team shared that, my real estate budget and what we're going to spend to either build new stores or to renovate existing will always eat our philanthropy budget for lunch, right? There's so much that we can do for philanthropy, and that's important. But I really recognize that if we can tap into my real estate budget, we'll drive so much more change. That's possible because those two teams went on a shared learning journey together. It wasn't just the corporate philanthropy team thinking about what it looks like to move forward on racial equity, but doing it in partnership with others throughout the business so that they could then make those changes even outside of what might be the sort of official or highly lauded public commitments of what's happening inside of the company. How do we start to think about making those types of connections? So these are just a few ideas of what it looks like to actually activate the business in this way. It moves us from this big vision idea and gets us from thinking of not only what can I do inside of corporate philanthropy, but what are the ways that I can touch and connect with others across the business to start to activate toward this broader vision. And with that, I'm going to pass this back to one of my colleagues.
Thanks so much, John. So you've heard from us today about a lot, about the context that has existed around racial inequity in our society, the gifts of the potential for racial equity that emerge from the corporate community, some of the tools that we've developed in collaboration and in conversation with stakeholders around ways to move forward. And then here, some really specific approaches that you might take to activate the work of corporate philanthropy for the cause of racial equity. And what we want to do now is pause and hear from you a little bit more. We have a couple of more audience polls for you. And this first is, what are your biggest roadblocks to deepening racial equity within your work? We know this isn't easy work. We know that it's complex and oftentimes can lead to a fear of making mistakes and therefore a decision not to try to proceed. And so we want to know, what is it that are your biggest obstacles? Is it about that lack of expertise and a sense of unease about what to do next? Are there constraints on financial resources, leadership buy-in, or the time or capacity that you have in order to move forward on racial equity work through your own efforts? And if there's something else that's not on this list, please put it in the chat. It's important we would like to know this, again, as we continue to learn from stakeholders and refine our work. But we also want you to hear from one another to see kind of what the state of your field is like and what others are experiencing as they work to integrate racial equity in their corporate philanthropy efforts. We'll give it just another few seconds for folks to respond and then share our results. Great. I think we can share results now. Thank you. So, and you can see here that there's really a spread across each of these obstacles. There are roadblocks that we're all experiencing in a variety of ways, and we really appreciate your willingness to share about them. At the top, we see a lack of financial resources and the complexity of the work. So not only not feeling like there is enough to move forward, but also recognizing that it's difficult, it's complex, and it requires digging in. And hopefully some of the tools and resources we've shared today give some purchase in that, but we know that there are more there are more tools, more resources that you may need. And actually with that, we'll move to the next poll that we have, which is asking quite plainly, what kind of support would you find most valuable? What feels really valuable in being able to overcome some of those barriers to move things forward in advancing racial equity through corporate philanthropy? Is it about having the opportunity to have some templates, some ways forward? Are consultants useful? Are specific tools to increase leadership buy-in something that would be of use? Having others' examples, such as companies showcasing their equity journeys transparently, or data that shows the business value, recognizing that oftentimes the business case is something that can push even really values-centered work. And then there's support. There's really intentional ongoing support, such as developing milestones as part of a multi-year plan alongside a partner. We'll give it just a few more seconds to see what others have to share about the kind of support that would feel most valuable in advancing this work. All right, we can go ahead and share these results as well. Here again, across the board, a breadth of tools that would be of use. And we recognize that, frankly, really all of these tools are probably necessary to walk alongside the work that you're doing and to continue to advance it. We may not ourselves be able to provide all of these supports, but it's really useful for us to know what kinds of tools would be most useful so that we're able to integrate them into the ongoing work that we have before us, as well as be really responsive to you as one of the many stakeholders that we have engaged in the work that we're doing as part of the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance. The blueprint that we've heard about today is one such resource, and we really hope that our ongoing work will support additional tools. And we'll hear from Mahalet about some of that work now.
Thank you, Kelly Francis. And thank you all for your participation. It is so helpful to us, as Kelly Francis said, in our work to hear from you and see how things are going for you. The actions we describe in the CEO blueprint, though, they provide a North Star, but they're not sufficient to align market actors around how to approach, measure, report, and incentivize progress. What's needed now is a shared language and approach for all of us, how we build equitable corporations and advance racial equity in the private sector. And to achieve that, the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance, along with many other partners, we're developing robust corporate performance standards on racial equity. We're going to set the bar for what good looks like, embed accountability within the standards and through our long-term adoption efforts, and establish consistency for how corporations should approach, measure, and disclose their progress on advancing racial equity. Now, this is a multi-year effort that you can learn more about on our website, and we would love to invite all of you to join us on this journey to achieve racial equity by defining what that looks like through performance metrics. And in that process, on this multi-year journey, we're going to be developing more tools and guidance and sharing stories about successes and also challenges and pitfalls. So we're excited that those are the tools and guidance that you need, and we're going to be working towards that in the process of developing performance standards. And with that, I'm going to transition back to Kelly Francis. Thank you.
Thanks, Mahalet. We really are building that big tent. And as a part of that big tent, we want to share with you what we have to offer so far and the kinds of progress we're continuing to make. So we hope that you will visit our website at corporateracialequityalliance.org and download the CEO blueprint, of which you've seen a preview today, that contains additional robust offerings in terms of actionable steps that leaders can take towards advancing racial equity through corporate action, as well as examples where companies have made some of those steps happen. We also hope that you'll sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date with the continued work that we have ongoing. And then again, we want to hear from you. This is a reciprocal and relational process. And so we hope that you'll share your company's experience taking action on racial equity to join in that growing cloud of witnesses really around what it looks like, how it is implemented, and how we can learn from and share with one another. And finally, please participate with us in a cohort of companies that will pilot our standards as we develop them and have them available to do so. So we hope that you'll be in touch in that way. We also, given that we have a bit of extra time, would love to invite any questions. I think we can maybe pause our screen share and I'll come on screen. And would love to encourage you to shift to gallery view to go off video if that's something that's available to you so that we can see your faces as well. Of course, no pressure to do so. You didn't necessarily sign up for that in joining this panel, but we'd love to hear from you and any questions that you have for us, anything that we can answer in the minutes that we have remaining to us. Feel free to submit them in chat or to take yourself off mute and simply to ask.
Hi there, I'm May from the East Bay Community Foundation. I'm happy to ask a question. So at the East Bay Community Foundation for many years now, we have been focusing on racial equity and racial justice. And in the last couple of years, our board actually updated our mission to specifically include that. And so the question that I have is, for community foundations like us, how can we be partnering with corporations to share the learnings that we have, and then also kind of, in a synergistic way, be able to partner and actually get more money out into the community or help raise that awareness? I noticed in the poll, there was a desire to see examples. And that would be fantastic, right, in terms of the transparency. And I want to say thank you so much for putting this panel together. And I'll put myself on mute so you can answer. Thank you.
I might take the lead here. Kendra and I actually just wrapped up some work with the Cleveland Foundation, helping to reset their strategy in this exact same way. So they are a few years behind you all. We actually lifted up East Bay Community Foundation in a bit of our work with them. And so your work is already influencing the community foundation field. I'll say what was critical in those conversations was twofold. One, I think we all know in the world of community foundations is how are we influencing our trustee banks? And what does that relationship look like? Moving those conversations from the more technical, contractual elements of the relationship to sharing these bigger ideas. What are the opportunities to tap into some of their community benefit plans and other opportunities there? And so I would put sort of the trustee banks and your local financial institutions in one category. The other part of this, though, has been this idea of what are the corporate's needs in your local area? And so in the instance of the Cleveland Foundation, Cleveland is really known for their work around fellowships and leadership development. They're sort of one of the founders behind the Coro program and many of these other ideas. And so what they've done with this work is to say, if we have a fellowship program and 3 of our funding peers have fellowship programs, and frankly, every corporation in Cleveland is trying to also attract high quality talent with these programs, what are the opportunity for us to actually link up and learn at this programmatic level? Now, May, to your point, that learning journey will be grounded in what is racial equity? What are these fundamentals? What are actually the systemic barriers? They are committed to ensuring that actually folks of color who are from Cleveland who have made it through these programs are bringing that information back to this group of what's working well, what isn't working well. But it's about creating that joint learning space that the Community Foundation is serving as a convener because they have the relationships. But frankly, it's about the conversation that's structured there, knowing that this could lead towards perhaps a new fellowship program, but really the relationships that are developed through the learning journey, along with the sort of voices of those who've been impacted along the way, has been that opportunity. We had a few different examples. I'm also thinking about folks in Buffalo, where once we get to the specifics of the engagement, being on that learning journey together has been one of those unlocks for many of the corporations who are doing some of this work.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question, May. Any other brief questions? All right, I think we'll move from here. Thank you for your time today. We really appreciate being able to spend the time with you to learn from your experiences and to be able to share of ours as we continue in this process together in the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance. Again, we encourage you to visit our website, corporateracialequityalliance.org, to stay involved in the work and so we can continue to learn from you and share with you what we're doing. And on behalf of the conference, we'd like to invite you to head back to Swap Card to enjoy DJ Lady Ryan, and then join the closing plenary, which is entitled Ensuring Nonprofits Are Central and kicks off at 12. At that plenary, you'll hear from Vu Le, founder of Nonprofit AF, and Fatima Angeles from the Levi Strauss Foundation, a one-to-one conversation. Then they'll be joined by several other nonprofit representatives for what stands to be a really lively conversation. So we hope to see you there and really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.